Today we'll be looking at a 9th generation Honda Civic Si. Don't forget to check the video description. I'll have links to everything that I'm using, and if you want to go to different sections of the tune-up, you can click on the links in there as well. Spark plugs and coil packs. So you're going to want to grab a wedge tool to remove the rubber cover on top of the nut for the wiper blade. And then you can use these wedge tools that I purchased, and they'll be in the description, to remove the plastic fasteners on the cowl trim. Sometimes it's really hard to remove things by hand, and having these wedge tools makes it easier. And always remember where you removed a piece of the trim from so that you can put it back. So now it's time to remove the wiper blade. We have to remove the wiper blade in order to get the cowl trim piece off. We're going to use a 17mm deep socket and our Tecton ratchet. Since this particular ratchet is a swivel head, it makes it easier to get it off. Always remember to keep the nuts next to where you removed your items, and as well as your trim pieces. You don't want to mix up the left and the right side of the car. Go ahead and lift up the wiper blade. It makes it easier to remove the wiper blade, and try to keep your wiper blades on the same side of the car that you worked on so you don't mess things up. And we're going to remove this other trim piece, and we need to do that in order to get the cowl trim off. There is another fastener to remove, and you may need the wedge tool to do that, but always keep your fasteners as well as your wedge tools handy for this job. So the right side of the cowl trim is loose. So we move to the left side. We're going to remove that fastener, which will remove this piece of the trim away. Next, we have to remove the washer line. Once we do that, we have better access to removing the cowl trim. All right, so now it's time to remove the metal guard over the engine. And we have 3 12mm bolts that we have to remove. Now these may be on there pretty tight. Just be prepared to have to really loosen this with a lot of strength, but in my case they were on fairly loose. $10mm, and there is a bolt that requires an extension on your socket to reach. And I usually will just loosen it enough to be able to turn the extension with my hand, like so. Now this one is fairly deep in there. It's another 10mm. I had to use a different extender to get to it, but it's the same process. And so now we can remove this part. All right, so back to the 10mm socket, and we're going to remove the cover that covers the spark plugs. These should not be on here very tight, and they should be fairly simple to remove. Just make sure that you don't lose your 4 bolts for your engine cover. That would be bad. You also want to make sure that this area is very clean. You don't want to introduce any dirt to the spark plugs or into the engine. So again, we're back on the 10mm here, and we're going to loosen the bolt that holds this coil pack in. It shouldn't be too difficult to remove, but just be careful. When you loosen things here, you don't want to overdo anything. All right, now the coil pack is loose, we can remove the connector. And these blue connectors to the coil packs can be pretty difficult to remove. You just have to squeeze down really hard and pull at the same time. Just try to be careful. You don't want to break the connector and have to replace that. All right, and once we get that off, we move it out of the way and we can pull the old coil pack out. Clean up as you go. You don't want to introduce any dirt to the system. So this is an NGK, it's what's recommended, and here is the part number. If you're interested, this stuff will all be in the description for you too. What I recommend is you pull out your new coil and you compare it. There's the part number. Make sure that it roughly is the same size. Now these sockets are designed for spark plugs, and they kind of rotate on the head as well as have this blue rubberized grip inside the socket to have it hold onto the spark plug more easily. So what you're going to do is put on a smaller ratchet in there, and you're just going to loosen it enough to where it breaks, and then you're going to disconnect the ratchet, and then you're going to hand loosen the rest of the way. It's very important that you do not damage the threading inside the engine. If you damage the threading inside the engine, you have a very, very big problem. So be very gentle when removing or adding anything. So here we have the old spark plug. We can take a look at it and see if it was in bad condition. Usually you'll see some damage here or corrosion or wear on the head, but we don't see that. Or we see maybe a crack in the ceramic of the spark plug, but we don't see that either. So it doesn't look like these spark plugs were in that bad of condition actually. We're going to use these NGK spark plugs, and we'll compare it to the old ones just to make sure we're not wildly off here. We're going to use some dielectric grease, and what this does is prevent moisture from getting into the system. So it's always good to make sure that we don't introduce any additional moisture into an engine. So we're going to spread some of that grease onto the ceramic part of our spark plug, and use gloves for this. Obviously, if you have grease on your hands or dirt, you do not want to introduce this to your system. And we just spread it gingerly around the ceramic like so. And then we add it to our handy dandy spark plug socket. And very gently lower it down and hand tighten it. If it doesn't feel like it's in the threading properly, reverse what you're doing. Do not try to force it. So once you've got it to a point where you cannot tighten it by hand anymore, you're going to use a torque wrench. And once you reach that one click, you're done. And I'll give you the exact torque specs for this. Now these are the NGK coils, and you notice they do come pre-greased, but I always will add a little extra dielectric grease. I just want to make sure that we're not introducing any moisture inside the engine, and that's what the grease's main purpose is for. So then we just lower in the coil, and you can push it down just to make sure that it does fit as you'd expect. It may pop up a little bit, but that's okay. The bolt is what's going to hold it in position. So we use that 10mm again, and we just tighten that bolt down. Then we add our blue connector back to the coil pack, and we have finished the spark plug replacement. Now we're going to do the next 3. Once all 4 are done, following the exact same process, we add our cover back to the top. And again, you have your 4 10mm bolts. You're going to want to hand tighten first, and then you can make sure they're snug with your ratchet. Now, before we put the cowl back on, just go ahead and start the engine and make sure that it starts normally. All right, so now it's time to put the cowl and the cowl trim back on. The cowl is now on, and we're tightening the 12mm bolts. We're going to do the right and then the left side. And we'll finish up the 10mm here with a long extension. As you can see, it's really, really deep in there, so you need a nice extension tool, and there's 2 of those. Finally, we put the cowl trim on top. And we're going to reconnect this windshield wiper fluid line. But first we have to put the plastic here underneath, sort of in between these 2 other pieces of trim. Once we do that, we're going to reattach this line. Eventually, you're going to be able to test to make sure that the fluid comes out as you would expect. If it doesn't, then you didn't put it on correctly. Always get these universal plastic fasteners because you rarely take the trim off, so you might as well use a new fastener. And the universal set is great, it'll fit any vehicle. Just force it in until it snaps, and it's snug. I use new fasteners all the time. Don't like reusing old ones, so pop those in. Put the hood down and then take this trim piece and the other trim piece, and you're going to want to fit this one over the bolt for the windshield wiper blades. And then use your fingers to fit the trim piece in. It's a little hard at first, but once you figure out how it fits, then you're just going to use your hands to try to get it as snug as possible. You may have to put a little force just to get it really in there. Then open the hood and you'll have this trim piece that you just press down on and it should snap in. Same thing on both sides. Tighten the 17mm and you're going to make sure that the left windshield wiper is below the right windshield wiper and put that rubber back on and you're done.